Maybe it's time you got a real job, sweetie, my mother said, her voice dripping with pity as she passed the mashed potatoes. My father nodded in agreement while my brother Marcus smirked from across the dining room. They were planning the family trust distribution, and everyone assumed I'd be left out because I never amounted to anything. My name is Sophie Bennett, I'm 34 years old, and as I sat there listening to them discuss who deserved the inheritance, I knew something they didn't. The publishing contract sitting in my desk drawer was worth $8 million, and tomorrow's New York Times would reveal that I was the anonymous author behind the Madison Gray thriller series that had dominated bestseller lists for 3 years. But sitting there at that Thanksgiving table in our family home in Boston, surrounded by the people who had spent the last decade dismissing my dreams, I kept my expression carefully neutral. Let them think what they wanted. The truth would reveal itself soon enough. Sophie's always been the dreamer of the family, my sister Victoria said, her tone making it sound like a terminal diagnosis. Still writing those little stories, aren't you? She exchanged knowing glances with Marcus, and I could see the familiar pattern of sibling solidarity forming against me. The disappointment, the family burden, the one who never quite measured up. I took a sip of wine and watched them, these people who shared my DNA but had never really known me at all. My father, Robert Bennett, sat at the head of the table like always, his expensive suit and Rolex watch announcing his success as a corporate attorney. My mother, Patricia, looked immaculate in her designer dress, every bit the society wife she'd worked so hard to become. Victoria, 37 and perfect, with her hedge fund manager husband and her corner office at a major investment bank. And Marcus, 32, already a partner at father's law firm, golden boy extraordinaire. And then there was me. Sophie, the writer, the dreamer, the disappointment. I think it's admirable that Sophie still pursues her passion, my Aunt Helen offered weakly from the end of the table, though even she sounded unconvinced. Not everyone needs to make millions to be happy. The implication hung in the air like smoke. I was the family charity case, the one they'd have to support eventually when my writing hobby inevitably failed completely. The trust distribution needs to be handled carefully, my father said, pulling out a folder thick with legal documents. Your grandmother left specific instructions about dividing her estate among her grandchildren based on their financial stability and career achievements. I felt my heart rate spike, but I kept my face blank. Grandmother Eleanor had passed away 6 months ago, and while I'd been grieving the loss of the only family member who'd ever encouraged my writing, apparently everyone else had been busy calculating their inheritance shares. Victoria and Marcus have clearly demonstrated financial responsibility, Mother continued, as if reading from a script they'd all rehearsed. They have stable careers, impressive portfolios, and they've made smart life choices. The unspoken message was crystal clear. I had done none of those things. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his smugness practically radiating across the table. I'm not saying Sophie doesn't deserve anything, he said in that patronizing tone he'd perfected over the years. But grandmother specifically mentioned rewarding those who'd achieved career success. Maybe a smaller share would be more appropriate for someone who's still finding their way. Finding my way. At 34, after a decade of dedication to my craft. The phrase made me want to laugh, but I bit my tongue. I've been thinking, Victoria chimed in, her voice taking on that fake sweet quality that meant she was about to deliver a particularly cruel blow. Maybe Sophie could use her portion of the inheritance to finally go back to school. Get a teaching degree or something practical. It's not too late to start over. The conversation continued around me as they discussed my future like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person with agency. They debated whether I should receive 10% or 15% of grandmother's estate, with the remaining 85 to 90% split between Victoria and Marcus. They suggested career paths I should consider. They wondered aloud if I'd ever find a husband or have children, or if my writing obsession would leave me alone and destitute in my old age. I sat there listening to it all, thinking about the 7 novels I'd published under my pseudonym. Thinking about the fan letters that arrived by the thousands. Thinking about the movie deals currently in negotiation. Thinking about the fact that my net worth was currently hovering around $23 million, while Marcus's vaunted partner salary probably capped out at $400,000 a year. But I said nothing. Not yet. The pattern of dismissal hadn't started at this dinner table. It had been building for years, maybe my entire life. Growing up as the youngest Bennett child meant learning early that I didn't quite fit the family mold. Victoria had been brilliant at everything academic, perfect grades, perfect college, perfect career trajectory. Marcus had followed in father's footsteps with almost eerie precision, as if his life path had been genetically predetermined. And then there was me, the child who'd rather read the network, who'd chosen creative writing over pre-law, who'd stubbornly insisted on pursuing publication instead of settling down with a practical career. I remembered being 24, fresh out of grad school with my MFA in creative writing, showing my family my first completed manuscript. I'd been so proud, so hopeful. I'd spent 2 years pouring my heart into that story, revising every sentence until it sang. "That's nice, dear," Mother had said, barely glancing at the printed pages. "But when are you going to start applying for real jobs? You can't make a living writing books." Father had been more direct. "Sophie, I didn't pay for your education so you could waste time on fantasies. The writing thing is fine as a hobby, but you need to think about your future." Only grandmother Eleanor had understood. She'd taken my manuscript, read every word, and called me 2 days later with tears in her voice. "You have a gift, Sophie," she'd said. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Keep writing. The world needs your stories." But grandmother Eleanor had been the exception in the Bennett family. Everyone else saw my writing as somewhere between a phase I'd outgrow and a mental illness that needed treatment. The rejection letters had been brutal that first year. Dozens of them, each one a small death to my confidence. My family watched my struggle with a mixture of pity and vindication, as if my failures proved they'd been right all along. "Maybe it's time to be realistic," Marcus had said after my 50th rejection. "Not everyone can be a novelist. It's not a personal failing, Sophie. It's just statistics." But I hadn't given up. I'd kept writing, kept submitting, kept believing in my work even when no one else did. I'd taken a job as a bookstore clerk to pay my bills, and I'd written in every spare moment. Early mornings before work, late nights after closing, weekends and holidays. I'd lived in a tiny studio apartment, eaten ramen more nights than I could count, and poured every dollar I could spare into writing workshops and conferences. And then, finally, after 3 years of relentless work and rejection, I'd gotten the email that changed everything. An agent wanted to represent me. Not just any agent, but one of the most respected in the industry. She'd loved my thriller manuscript, the story of a female detective hunting a serial killer through the streets of Chicago. She thought it could be huge. I remembered calling grandmother Eleanor first, before anyone else. She'd cried with joy, told me she'd always known this day would come. "But Sophie," she'd warned me, "maybe don't tell the rest of the family just yet. Let them see the proof of your success before they find new ways to diminish it." Her advice had proven prophetic. When I'd mentioned to Mother that I'd gotten an agent, she'd smiled vaguely and said, "That's nice, dear. Let us know if anything comes of it." As if representation from a top New York agent was somehow still not enough to prove I was serious. The book had sold at auction 6 weeks later. 12 publishers had bid on it, driving the price up to $300,000 for a 2-book deal. I'd cried in my tiny apartment, unable to believe that my words, my story, were worth that much to someone. But I'd followed grandmother's advice and kept the news quiet. I'd told my family I'd sold a book, but I'd minimized the advance, said it was modest, and enough to keep writing for a while. They'd congratulated me with the same tone people use when a child shows them a crayon drawing, pleased that I was happy but clearly not taking it seriously. "Just don't quit your day job," Father had advised. First-time authors rarely make any real money. The book had published under my pseudonym, E.M. Sterling, a decision I'd made partly for privacy and partly because I'd wanted my work judged on its own merit rather than my family connections. My agent had suggested using initials rather than a female first name, an unfortunate reality of the thriller genre's demographic assumptions. And then something magical had happened. Readers had found my book. Word of mouth had spread. Book clubs had selected it. Suddenly, Hidden Crimes by E.M. Sterling was climbing bestseller lists, and my publisher was frantically ordering additional print runs. The book had spent 18 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, eventually hitting number 1. The success had been surreal, overwhelming, and absolutely validating. Grandmother Eleanor had bought dozens of copies and given them to everyone she knew, bursting with pride for her granddaughter even if she couldn't publicly claim credit. But to the rest of my family, I was still Sophie Bennett, the struggling writer with a published book that they assumed had sold a few thousand copies at most. They'd never connected E.M. Sterling with their disappointment of a daughter. Why would they? In their minds, I was incapable of that level of success. Over the next 4 years, I'd published 6 more novels in the Madison Gray series. Each one had been more successful than the last. Foreign rights deals, audiobooks that topped the charts, a passionate fan base that analyzed every clue and twist, movie studios circling with adaptation offers. I'd made millions, plural. I'd bought a beautiful brownstone in a historic Boston neighborhood, though I'd told my family I was renting a place from a friend. I'd invested wisely, hired a financial advisor, and built the kind of security my family constantly worried I'd never achieve. And through it all, I'd maintained my cover. Sophie Bennett, the struggling writer. Sophie Bennett, the family disappointment. Sophie Bennett, who probably still needed money for rent. The cognitive dissonance must have been staggering, but my family had mastered the art of not seeing what they didn't want to see. When Victoria had mentioned loving the E.M. Sterling books at a family gathering, I'd nearly choked on my wine. She'd gone on and on about the brilliant plot twists, the compelling protagonist, the masterful suspense. She'd wondered aloud who E.M. Sterling really was, speculated about their background, their inspiration. Never once had she considered that the author she admired might be sitting across from her, quietly sipping wine and letting her talk. Marcus had actually given me an E.M. Sterling book for Christmas 2 years ago. I know it's not your usual literary fiction, he said condescendingly, but sometimes it's nice to read something fun and commercial. Don't worry, I won't tell your writer friends you're reading thrillers. I thanked him graciously and added the book to my collection, which already included 5 copies of that particular title in various editions and languages. The secret had been both a burden and a protection. A burden because I couldn't share my success with my family, couldn't celebrate my achievements openly. But a protection because their dismissal no longer had the power to wound me. How could their opinions matter when I knew the truth? When millions of readers around the world loved my work? When I'd achieved success beyond anything they'd accomplished in their practical careers? Now, sitting at this Thanksgiving table listening to them debate my financial future, I felt that burden lifting. Tomorrow's New York Times would run a major profile piece revealing my identity. The secret would be out. The cat, as they say, would be thoroughly out of the bag. I think 15% is more than fair for Sophie, Father was saying, making notes in his legal pad. It's enough to provide some security while she figures out her next steps. We just want you to be okay, sweetie, Mother added, reaching across the table to pat my hand with genuine concern. We worry about you, living alone, no stable income, no prospects. At least with this inheritance, you'll have something to fall back on. Victoria nodded sagely. Maybe you could finally take that trip to Europe you always talked about. Do some traveling, get inspired, figure out what you really want to do with your life. The suggestions kept coming, each one revealing how little they understood me, how completely they'd underestimated everything I'd built. They meant well, I supposed. In their own way, they loved me. But their love had always come with conditions, with expectations that I'd never been able to meet. Or rather, expectations I'd exceeded so completely that they couldn't even comprehend it. Actually, I said quietly, speaking for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. The conversation stopped abruptly, everyone turning to look at me as if surprised I was still there. I appreciate your concern, but I'm doing fine financially. Marcus laughed, though it sounded more nervous than amused. Sophie, come on. We know you're barely scraping by. There's no shame in accepting help from family. I'm not barely scraping by, I said, my voice steady and calm. In fact, I'm doing quite well. Victoria exchanged glances with Marcus, that familiar sibling telepathy that had excluded me my entire life. Honey, she said in her most soothing voice, working at a bookstore is fine, but let's be realistic about your financial situation. I haven't worked at the bookstore in 4 years, I replied. I've been writing full-time since my first novel sold. Father frowned, his lawyer's mind trying to process information that didn't fit his assumptions. Sophie, we've been over this. One published book doesn't constitute a career. You need stable employment, benefits, a retirement plan. I have all of those things, I said. Plus a financial advisor, an investment portfolio, and a rather impressive 401k, if I do say so myself. The skepticism on their faces would have been comical if it weren't so insulting. They literally could not process what I was telling them. It didn't fit their narrative of who I was. Look, Marcus said, his patience clearly wearing thin, we're trying to help you. Stop being stubborn and accept that you need this inheritance. I don't need the inheritance, I said simply. But thank you for thinking of me. Of course you need it, Mother insisted, her voice rising with frustration. How else will you support yourself when this writing fantasy finally runs its course? I took a deep breath, recognizing that the moment had arrived sooner than I'd planned. Tomorrow's article would have been my preferred reveal, controlled and professional. But sitting here listening to them discuss my fictional poverty, I couldn't wait another 24 hours. The writing fantasy has run its course for about $23 million so far, I said quietly. Give or take a few $100,000 depending on this quarter's royalties. The silence that fell over the dining room was so complete I could hear the antique clock ticking in the hallway. What? Victoria finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. My net worth is currently around $23 million, I repeated, keeping my voice matter of fact. Though that number fluctuates based on market conditions and foreign rights deals. Tomorrow's New York Times is running a profile revealing my identity as E.M. Sterling, so I suppose there's no point in keeping it secret any longer. Father's fork clattered against his plate. Marcus had gone completely pale. Victoria was staring at me like I'd suddenly sprouted a second head. Mother's hand was frozen halfway to her wine glass, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound. You're lying, Marcus said finally, his voice higher than usual. That's impossible. I pulled out my phone and opened it to my banking app, tilting the screen so they could see the balance. 7 figures, comfortably sitting there in my checking account alone. Would you like to see my investment accounts too? Or maybe my royalty statements? I have the last 4 years of earnings documentation if you need proof. E.M. Sterling, Victoria breathed, her face cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that might have been dawning horror. You're E.M. Sterling, the E.M. Sterling, the one whose books I've been reading. The one whose books are being adapted into movies. That would be me, I confirmed, watching the realization spread across their faces like ripples in water. 7 novels so far in the Madison Gray series. Number 8 comes out next spring. HBO is developing the series for television. We should have a pilot by next year. Father had recovered enough to speak, though his voice sounded strangled, unfamiliar. Sophie, why wouldn't you tell us? Your own family? Because of this, I said, gesturing around the table at their shocked, disbelieving faces. Because you were so convinced I was failing that you never thought to ask if I might actually be succeeding. Because telling you would have meant enduring your disbelief, your skepticism, your need to diminish anything that didn't fit your expectations of who I should be. That's not fair, Mother protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? I met her eyes steadily, calmly. How many times have I mentioned my writing over the years? How many times did you change the subject or suggest I needed a backup plan? Tonight you were literally discussing how to divide an inheritance based on career success while excluding me because you assumed I had no career at all. But you never said you were making money, Marcus argued, though his face had gone from pale to flushed with embarrassment. You let us think you were struggling. I told you I sold books, I countered. I told you I'd gotten an agent, sold a manuscript, had novels published. You chose to interpret that as failure because success didn't fit your narrative of who I was supposed to be. Victoria was scrolling frantically on her phone, pulling up articles about E.M. Sterling, comparing the sparse biographical information available with what she knew about me. Oh my God, she whispered, her voice shaking. The timeline matches. The Boston connection. The criminal justice background research. It's all you. It's always been me, I said, feeling a strange sense of liberation in finally saying the words out loud. Every word, every plot twist, every character. I built this career myself while you were all convinced I was wasting my life. The dining room had descended into chaos. Father was demanding to see contracts, his lawyer brain unable to accept anything without documentation. Mother was crying, though I couldn't tell if it was from shock, guilt, or some combination of both. Marcus sat frozen, his entire worldview apparently short-circuiting in real time. Victoria kept reading articles on her phone, muttering, "Oh my God," every few seconds as she connected dots that had apparently been invisible to her before. The New York Times profile comes out tomorrow, I continued, standing up from the table with a composure I'd never felt before in their presence. They'll be revealing my identity publicly for the first time. There's already significant media interest. My publicist has been fielding interview requests for weeks. So I'd appreciate it if you'd keep this information private until the article runs. After that, feel free to tell whoever you'd like. Sophie, wait, Father said, his legal instincts kicking in even through his shock. We need to discuss this. The trust distribution, your grandmother's intentions, the legal implications. Actually, I interrupted gently but firmly, we don't need to discuss anything. Grandmother Eleanor knew about my success. I told her everything. We had long conversations about my career, my books, my readers. She was the one who encouraged me to use a pseudonym in the first place, who suggested I keep my success private until I was ready to share it on my own terms. Mother's crying intensified, her carefully applied makeup running in dark streams down her cheeks. Eleanor knew? Your grandmother knew and she didn't tell us? She respected my privacy, I said simply. She understood that I needed to build my career without the weight of family expectations and judgments. And she changed her will accordingly, 6 months before she died. The color drained from Marcus's face so quickly I thought he might actually faint. What do you mean she changed her will? I pulled out a document from my bag, one I'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Or perhaps knowing that the right moment would eventually find me. Grandmother left specific instructions with her attorney. The trust was to be divided based on career achievement and financial stability, as you said. But she defined those terms differently than you assumed. I slid the paper across the table. It was a letter, written in Grandmother Eleanor's distinctive handwriting, dated just 3 months before her death. She left 60% of her estate to me, I said quietly, watching their faces as the words sank in. Because, in her words, I had demonstrated extraordinary career success through dedication, persistence, and genuine passion for my craft. The remaining 40% is to be split between the two of you. The explosion that followed was immediate and entirely predictable. Marcus shouted about unfair influence and manipulation. Victoria accused me of taking advantage of an elderly woman. Father demanded to see the legal documents, already threatening to contest the will. Mother just cried harder, overwhelmed by revelations that had shattered her entire understanding of her youngest daughter. But I remained calm, centered in a way I'd never felt before in their presence. This wasn't about the money, not really. Grandmother's estate, while substantial, was nothing compared to what I'd already earned on my own. This was about validation, about finally being seen for who I really was rather than who they decided I should be. The will is legally sound, I said, my voice cutting through their protests with unexpected authority. Grandmother worked with 3 different attorneys to ensure it couldn't be contested. She was of sound mind, there was no undue influence, and her reasoning is clearly documented. She left detailed explanations of her decisions, including specific citations of each grandchild's career achievements and financial status. This is insane, Marcus said, his face red with anger and embarrassment. You can't just show up and destroy everything we thought we knew. I didn't destroy anything, I replied calmly. I've been the same person all along. You just never bothered to really see me. Victoria had stopped looking at her phone and was now staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before on her face. Not quite respect, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. The books, she said slowly, as if testing the words. The books I've been reading and recommending to everyone. Those were yours. Your words. Your stories. Yes, I confirmed simply. They're brilliant, she whispered, and for the first time in my memory, she sounded genuinely humble. I've read them all multiple times. I've been waiting for the next one. I never imagined. I mean, you're actually talented. Really, genuinely talented. The backhanded compliment should have stung, but instead I felt something like hope stirring in my chest. Maybe this revelation would crack open the possibility of real relationships with my siblings, ones based on truth rather than assumptions and hierarchies. I've always been talented, I said gently but firmly. You just never gave my work a chance because it didn't fit your definition of success. Father had been reading grandmother's letter, his lawyer's eyes scanning every word with professional intensity. When he finally looked up, his expression had shifted from anger to something more complex, more uncomfortable. She talks about watching you struggle, he said quietly, his voice catching in a way I'd never heard before. About how proud she was that you never gave up despite our complete lack of support. She says. He paused, seeming to wrestle with the words. She says we failed you by measuring your worth against standards that had nothing to do with what actually mattered to you. Eleanor always did have a way with words, Mother said, wiping her eyes with a napkin that was already ruined beyond saving. She got that honestly, apparently. From her granddaughter. The acknowledgement hung in the air between us, fragile but real. We sat there in silence for a long moment, the Thanksgiving dinner cold and forgotten on our plates, the trust documents scattered across the table like evidence at a crime scene, the family dynamic irrevocably altered by truths that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. What happens now? Victoria finally asked, her voice small and uncertain in a way I'd never heard from my confident older sister. Now, I said, standing and gathering my things with deliberate calm, you decide whether you want to actually know me, or whether you'd prefer to keep relating to the version of me you created in your heads. Because I'm done pretending to be your idea of who Sophie Bennett should be. I'm E.M. Sterling. I'm a best-selling author. I'm financially successful beyond anything you imagined for me. And I built all of it while you were convinced I was failing.